This is Rob Dix from the Property Geek podcast, and you're listening to Informed Choice Radio.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Informed Choice Radio. My guest on the show today is Rob Dix, someone who you may well already know if you're at all interested in the world of property investing. Rob is co-host of the incredibly popular The Property Podcast along with Rob Bence. He's also founder of the Property Geek blog and podcast and author of several popular property investing books. Rob's new book is How to Be A Landlord, a straightforward guide to everything involved in letting and managing a property, whether you're an accidental landlord or an enthusiastic investor. In his characteristic, simple and entertaining language, How to Be a Landlord covers important steps like preparing the property to let, advertising for tenants, conducting viewings, doing all the paperwork, managing the tenancy and dealing with any tricky situations that crop up. In this episode, we talk about whether property investing is right for everyone, how Rob got started with his first buy-to-let, if the future for this asset remains bright, finding good value in the current market, some of the pitfalls associated with being a landlord, and steps to finding great tenants. Please do take a moment to connect with Rob on Twitter, where you can find him at Rob Dix, that's at ROBDIX. Mention me too, I'm at Martin Bamford. You can find the show notes for this episode at icradio.co.uk/249. There's useful links there, and you can also download the full episode transcript. That's all at icradio.co.uk/249. Here's my conversation with Rob Dix, author of How to Be a Landlord. Well, welcome back to Informed Choice Radio. Today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome Rob Dix. Rob is author of How to Be a Landlord, the definitive guide to letting and managing your rental property. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Could you start by telling our listeners a bit about you and about your background and what it is you do today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I got interested in property about 10 years ago, and it's sort of gradually taken over my life from there. It's about 10 years since I bought my first property. I started gradually building up my own portfolio, getting really interested in it, reading about it a lot. And at some point during that process, I started a blog called Property Geek. And that was just kind of a reason to explore more, talk to other people, share some of what I was learning. And then spun out of that, I started co-hosting a podcast called The Property Podcast. And everything got a bit crazy. That got very popular. It turns out lots of people in the UK are interested in property. Who knew? And as a result of that, lots of other opportunities came about. So I now co-own a letting agency and a bridging finance company, and I've written a few books about property as well. So lots of cool things have happened, and it's all really come from my enthusiasm about property as an asset class, and also my enjoyment of explaining complex issues to other people, I suppose.
Good stuff. And you describe yourself online as an investor, a writer, and a complete property geek. And that's obviously the title of your podcast too. Mm-hmm. What sets you apart from other property investors in terms of sheer geekery?
I think I go pretty deep. I'm led by the numbers, which I know a lot of investors are, but in property, you get a lot of people who make maybe more emotional or pragmatic purchases. But for me, it's all about the numbers. I analyze things in quite a lot of detail. I also think about the economics of it quite a lot. So there's this perception that some people have that with property, you just always win. Property always goes up, but that's just not the case. They don't just go up. Prices don't go up equally for every type of property or in every location. And I think that's really important. So I get quite geeky about the economics of it. And I speak to a lot of people as well. I had one of my books was just completely full of interviews with other investors. And so I'm quite geeky about figuring out what works for other people, analyzing different strategies that have worked, who they would work for, what the key factors were. So I think it's a few different things, but cumulatively, I think I just think about this stuff more than most, and perhaps more than is healthy.
I'm sure it's perfectly healthy. So you talked about in the UK, it's obviously very popular to invest in property. Would you say that property investing is something that could be suitable for anyone, or is there a certain type of person that it makes it more suitable for?
I certainly wouldn't say it was right for everyone. You'll know better than anyone that there is no type of investment. There is no one right thing for everyone to do. And I think that's even more the case with property. Everyone will be quite aware of the advantages, so I don't need to try and sell it. But there are real disadvantages, or at least things to be aware of as well. So, for example, you need to do quite a lot of research, I think, if you're going to invest wisely. It's not really the case that you can just kind of piggyback off someone else's research or buy at random or buy some kind of index. You need to learn quite a lot. And I actually had a friend recently who he emailed me and said, I've just read your book and decided not to invest in property because I've realized how much there is that I should know to do it properly. And I was actually really pleased about that because I thought, well, it's good that people realize that there's quite a lot to it. It also involves work. So even if you outsource the management of it, you still can't completely just forget you own it, like you could do with a portfolio of shares, for example. And it's kind of lumpy and illiquid. So if that worries you, then that's a drawback. And obviously, it's got a place in a balanced portfolio. I'm not saying that, obviously, that nobody should invest in property because I'm really keen on it. But at the same time, I would never say that that's all you should do or that everyone should be doing it.
So take us back 10 years ago when you bought your first investment property. What was that experience like? You know, what did you look for? Were you already on the property market as an owner of a sort of the house you lived in at that point, or was property a completely new asset for you?
Yeah, well, 10 years ago was an interesting time in property. I bought my own home right at the peak of the market. I was lucky that after the crash, it bounced back pretty quickly. But that was sort of me buying a place to live. And then weirdly, I sort of bought somewhere to live in a very kind of atypical for me kind of way. I just needed a place to live. I was sick of commuting. And so I bought somewhere. I didn't think about it too much. But then about a year later, I had some money saved up, needed to do something with it. What do you do? Well, like I said, if you're British, then you think about putting it in property, don't you? And that was after the crash. So that would have been sort of around about 2008, which in retrospect was the absolute perfect time to be buying a property. Looking back, I wish I'd done so much more because nobody was buying. You'd like walk into an estate agent and be greeted like a celebrity because you'd be the only person who'd been in there all week. Everyone was terrified of buying property. So in retrospect, it was a great time to be buying. I did quite a lot of research. I did lots of reading around it. But like a lot of people, I ended up just buying as close to home as I could afford. I ended up buying a flat in Tottenham in North London. It cost about 130,000. It's worth about double that now. London's grown really strongly, as most people probably know. But because I bought it at such a good price, it still yields brilliantly well. It's been really easy. It's only had 2 changes of tenant in that whole time. So it was a really positive experience. I always say that your first investment is normally not your best because you learn a lot from doing that first one. In my case, though, the first one was pretty good, mostly just fluke. But luckily, because it was a positive experience, it encouraged me to go on and do more.
And it sounds like that first experience of buying investment property was quite nice and quite pleasant and quite easy, really. So was the second a bit harder? Did you have to give a bit more thought to it?
Yeah, I actually think that I've made my life a lot more difficult, and I'm aware that I sometimes do this for other people as well by encouraging. I always encourage myself to think about things quite deeply, and other people to do the same as well, and really think about the investment case. But it does make life more difficult because there's always a reason not to do something if you look hard enough, and so you can end up talking yourself out of lots of different things and overanalyzing. So I would say that ignorance can be bliss to an extent, but of course it can trip you up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you said when you bought that first flat in Tottenham, it was obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, a fantastic time to buy. It was post-crash. The prices were depressed. There wasn't much activity in the way of buyers out there. But more recently, I think it's fair to say, particularly in London, in the southeast, property prices have looked a lot higher. But we've also seen government intervention, haven't we? We've seen higher stamp duty. We've seen them paring back a bit on tax reliefs on property investing. So is the future still bright for property investing in the UK? Is it still a good time to be looking at this?
It can be, but I do think that you need to be a bit smarter about it and work a little bit harder. It's been really interesting being as involved in property as I have been over the last decade and talking to lots of other people through the podcast and things like that, because I've seen so many different changes of attitude. So when we started the podcast back in, I think it was 2012 maybe, everything was still very fresh from the crash. We were sort of having to talk up property and get people interested in it because there was still this all this concern around it, and prices in London had bounced back, but in lots of other places they hadn't. A couple of years on from that, everyone was really enthusiastic, and we were having to talk things down a little bit, and everyone was sort of back in full swing. But then it was the budget of 2015 where the first of these kind of anti-investor, if you want to call them that, measures came in. And then every time something was announced for the next couple of years, it seemed like there was another thing targeting the buy-to-let landlord. And things really changed again. And my inbox, which was full of just people being really excited, turned to people being very worried and asking lots and lots of questions about tax and corporate structures and things, which was never the case before. So I think it's the case that property investing can still work extremely well, but you need to get professional about it. Like if you bought a property 20 years ago, basically anything, then you really couldn't lose if you'd held it all this time. Even going through a fairly major crash, you still would have come out of it very well. I don't think that's the case anymore. I don't think you can just go out and buy anything and still be okay. You need to buy well, you need to add value, or you need to buy somewhere that's got a strong case for prices doing particularly well. You can't just gamble on the fact that prices always go up. And you do need to educate yourself about it, because there are all these factors now that you mentioned, some of which you can mitigate, others that you can't, but you really need to be aware of it. The tax position especially. I think a lot of people don't even know about. And if you bought not being aware of that, you could find that the investment post-tax is a lot less profitable than you thought it was. So you do need to educate yourself. But thankfully, that's never been easier. There's lots of resources around now. And I think, again, over the long term, it will continue to be a very strong asset class because of the fundamentals that underpin it.
So is it a case in terms of finding good value, good prospect properties to choose the right regions or the right types of property, or a combination of the two perhaps?
It's both, because you need to be thinking about a couple of different things. So you want to have an immediate income stream in terms of your monthly profit with the rent minus expenses. And then you're also hoping to get growth over time. And you really do need to be having both. So about 10 years ago, you were seeing people so excited about growth that they would just buy things at any price, not caring if it made any profit month to month, because they thought that it would go up over time. And that's just gambling, of course. It looks very obvious now. But you need to have that. And so as anyone listening in or around London will be aware, that's very difficult to actually achieve. But then as well as that, you need to be buying somewhere where you think it's got a good potential for growth. And there are lots of areas, not just regions, but also within any given city, there are areas that are not so nice, frankly. Therefore, prices are cheaper. Therefore, they yield quite well, but they're just not going to have that uplift. Some areas get improved over time, but others you can just kind of tell are never going to be like that. So even now, like you look back over the last 10 years, in some areas prices have doubled. In others, they're still below where they were 10 years ago. So it is very different, and that's why I think you need to research it a bit. So I'm not necessarily saying that people have to go out and buy in some part of the country that's absolutely miles away from where they live. Probably within about an hour of wherever you are, there are areas that will work reasonably well. But rather than just kind of defaulting to the next street over, I do think that the location and the type of property needs some thought.
How do you find a decent investment property? I'm guessing it's not as simple as going to the estate agents in the local high street and saying, what have you got in the books? Or is that part of the process?
It can be part of it. I think it depends on how much time and effort you're willing and able to put in. So you're always going to get the best deals if you go off market. So effectively, you find things before anyone knows it's for sale. So by the time it appears in the estate agent's window, most of the best deals have gone. So you're looking at people who need to sell quickly because of death or divorce, or they're moving or whatever. They need to sell quickly, therefore they will sell at a low price. And normally, they don't have time to go through the whole process. So auction is one way that those get sold. But you also get people locally who just specialize in marketing for these types of situations and finding these properties and buying them before anyone else knows they exist. Now, that involves a lot of work. It involves things like going around leafleting or putting adverts in the paper. It's really hard work, but some people do that and they do really well. Then at the other end of the scale, you've got like literally going on to Rightmove and picking one and seeing if you can knock a few percent off the asking price. And then in the middle, you've got still kind of sticking with the more mainstream channels. So estate agents are probably going to be a part of it, but just maybe not just going in and buying the first thing that you see, but trying to sort of be patient, stick around, see what they've got, offer on lots of things. And then when your offer gets rejected, just keeping on following up because again, people will probably be aware that a lot of property transactions fall through. I think it's about 1 in 3, once an offer has been accepted, actually never end up completing for various reasons. So as an investor, if you're willing to be patient and follow up and put the effort in, you can then sort of move in. And that offer that was rejected a couple of months ago could suddenly look a lot more attractive. So it's not necessarily looking for completely novel channels that nobody else is aware of, but just, I suppose, being patient and being willing to go and look at a lot, be told no a lot of times, and then follow up, which is obviously difficult to do if you've got a full-time job and you're busy. But realistically, that is what needs to be done if you do want to get a unusually good deal.
And of course, buying a property, an investment property is one thing, but once you own it, you need to become a landlord and all that involves. And that's the subject of your latest book, How to Be a Landlord. In all of the excitement of buying an investment property and finding the right property and maybe also renovating it once you become the owner, do you think the becoming a landlord step sometimes gets neglected?
I think it can do. I think for the most part, most investors really do care and they do want to do a good job. But the problem is that they just don't know what they're supposed to do. That's a large part of why I wrote the book. There are so many legal requirements that you just wouldn't know about unless you really went looking. And those are things that can get you into big trouble if you don't do them properly. And those things affect tenants and their experience as well. So I'd say that there are a lot of brilliant landlords out there. There are also some out-and-out rogues, but the majority are well-meaning but could do better. And the purpose of writing the book was just to make people aware of what needed to be done and bring it all together into one place. Because like so many things, you can find all the information if you go out and you comb the internet and piece it all together. But most people, however well-intentioned they are, just aren't going to have the time to go and do that. So I thought I'd do it for them.
And what are some of the legal traps? What are some of the pitfalls you can fall into if you don't know about the law and risk getting it wrong?
Oh, there's a lot. A lot of them are very seem basic, but again, nobody's actually going to tell you that when you buy a property, it doesn't come with a manual that says what you've got to do. So, for example, really obvious, but you need to protect a tenant's deposit in one of 3 different government schemes. So when they pay their deposit to be held against damages or unpaid rent or anything like that, you can't just keep it in your bank account. You have to actually register it with a scheme, and that gives tenants certain protections. It means that you can't just go and take the whole thing at the end, whether they've done anything wrong or not, which is what some landlords used to do, which is now why we now have these rules. That's been in place for 10 years. Amazingly, so many landlords still don't know that and don't do it properly. And it's the cause of so much trouble, because you can get fined up to 3 times the value of the deposit. You also can be unable to evict tenants if you want to, but you haven't protected their deposit properly. So it's something really basic like that can just cause all these problems because you're not aware. And then there's more subtle things as well. So like now for the last couple of years, you need to check your tenant's immigration status. That's just not something that you would think that you had to do as a landlord. It wouldn't cross your mind necessarily, but you do. And if you don't, you can get fined or you can get into trouble. So it's all these things that none of them, once you actually know about them, is that challenging. But you just wouldn't know unless you went looking.
And what are some of the lessons in the book about becoming a successful landlord? Are there some basic steps that people need to follow some sort of principles they need to take on board?
Yeah, a lot of it is about just setting things up properly, really. If you set the tenancy up right in the first place, it makes everything else a heck of a lot easier. So deposits are something that I mentioned. Having the proper documentation, having a good tenancy agreement is so important. A good tenancy agreement is like a manual for how the tenancy should be run. And any kind of situation that you encounter, you or the tenant should be able to look at the tenancy agreement and it will tell you what should happen. If you don't have a good agreement and there's ambiguity, that's bound to lead to some kind of disputes. So getting things set up properly, there's lots of legal bits around that and the different kind of documents that you need to produce. But then once all that's set up, really, I think it's just a case of staying on top of things, I suppose. So late rent is a big one. The main fear of most landlords, and rightly so, is the tenant just not paying, or they start paying, then after a few months, the rent stops arriving. So getting on top of late rent instantly is really important. If you seem like you're a bit slack on it, so like maybe it's a week late before you notice and you start following it up, the wrong type of tenant will notice that, and they'll realize that you're probably going to let things slide, and therefore they'll start taking the mick a bit. The same goes with inspections. You need to be inspecting the property regularly. And if you don't inspect, that's where small problems can become larger. So you might find that, if you inspected and you noticed that the gutters had a load of leaves in them, if you noticed that early, then you could clear them out and no problem. If you don't notice it for years because you don't inspect, then you'll end up with lots of water running down the outside of the wall, lots of damp problems. The tenant will then complain about that. It'll cost you a lot of money to fix it. And it gets more difficult just because you're not inspecting the property. And then I think in general, then just being responsive but not too responsive to what tenants want. So you as a landlord have obligations. There are certain things you have to do. There are certain things that you should do because you are providing a service and they're paying for that service. But you don't have to be contactable at all hours unless it's a genuine emergency. So I think it's finding that balance really of doing a good job, but without letting it take over your life. And if you can be a bit smart about it, you can be proactive. That avoids having problems later, and you can just do things, I guess, a bit more efficiently. And if you do that, then managing doesn't have to be all that challenging. It's a bit of work at the start, making sure that everything's set up properly. But after that, and if you put the right tenant in there, which is critical, then the rest of it, for the most part, can be pretty plain sailing.
Mm. And you talked about getting the right tenant, finding the right tenant, having the right relationship with that tenant. How do you find tenants? Where's the best place to find them? I think if I was going to approach it, I'd probably put an ad on Gumtree or a notice in the local newsagents or something. Where would you suggest people look for tenants? Yeah, that can work. It depends on the type of tenant. So for the most part, if you're looking for a typical kind of like working professional or a working family, the best place to start is probably with the portals like Rightmove and Zoopla, because that's where the majority of tenants will be looking. So if you're on there, you'll get the most eyeballs. And that's important because what, of course, you really want is as many people interested as possible, so you can then filter down to who you want rather than just having to take the one person who applies. You can't directly list on those portals as a private landlord, but there are lots of services where for probably about £100 they'll put it on there for you. So that's a good place to look from in most cases. Gumtree works. It works well in London and the southeast. In some other areas it's not so popular. For some reason the quality of tenants is really variable through Gumtree. You get a lot of strange things coming back when you advertise on there, but you get some good things as well. So you just have to filter. Go on, I have to ask you to elaborate on strange things. I don't know why, but you just end up getting some very odd responses. So you'll get some people where you'll get people coming back and asking really odd questions about that they don't seem to have read the advert properly or even know what it is that they're writing about. You'll get other things that are clearly scams, and you have to be quite careful because you'll get some people coming back and saying, can I move in? I want to move in tomorrow and I'll pay the whole year up front or something like that. And you might think, okay, oh, that sounds fantastic.
but actually it's some kind of scam and that you'll end up not getting the money. So you have to be a little bit careful. I don't know why it's Gumtree more than the others, but it seems to be the case.
Is there any value in using a lettings agent then to find tenants, to manage that tenant's relationship, or is it best for property investors to do it all themselves?
Yeah, there's absolutely value in it. I own a letting agency, so I would say that, but I wouldn't say you have to use a letting agency. If you actually enjoy the process of doing it yourself, then there's absolutely no reason to pay someone else to do it. Or if it's something that you want to say, maybe you want to do it for the first one to learn how it all works and then pass it over in future or something like that. But if you don't enjoy it, or you don't have the time, or both, then paying something like 10% of the rent to a letting agent isn't a bad deal at all. You could never be 100% hands off. You still need to respond to your agent's emails or calls when they've got queries or things they need you to make decisions on. But it does make things a lot easier. We've got lots of landlords who've never seen the property that they are letting through us. They're extremely hands off. They just have to reply when we email them, and that's about it. You do need to make sure that it's a good letting agent, of course, because if you've got a bad letting agent, then you're probably going to spend as much time chasing around after them as you would chasing around after a tenant if you did it yourself anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on Informed Choice Radio today. It's a really informative conversation. How can our listeners find out more about you? How can they find out about your books and about the podcast?
Well, they can either go to my blog, which is at propertygeek.net, or for the books specifically, you can just go onto Amazon, search property, and you'll find them there.
Good stuff. Thank you so much for your time. That's great.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
A big thank you to Rob for joining me on the podcast today. I've come quite close to buying investment property on a couple of occasions before, but I've never gone through with it. What I love about Rob's approach is his pragmatism and the balance that he brings to this area of investing. Property investing is not right for everyone, but for those who do take the plunge, Rob's advice and his experience are invaluable, especially when it comes to the details, like being an effective landlord. What was your favourite part of our conversation? Do let me know on Twitter at Martin Bamford, or in the comments section in the show notes for this episode at icradio.co.uk/249. That's also where you can find some useful links and the full transcript for this episode. That's all at icradio.co.uk/249. Don't forget to connect with Rob on Twitter. I know he'd love to hear from you. You can find him there at Rob Dix. That's at ROBDIX. And before you go, please take a moment to share this podcast episode with a friend on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Each time you share an episode on social media, it helps to boost us up the podcasting charts and reach even more new listeners. And if you've not done so before, please do leave us a quick rating and review on iTunes. Or if you listen to this episode in Overcast, which is my favourite podcast player, press the star button next to the episode. Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.